protests in China. This month, we are seeing something new, something unprecedented. Last month, we saw something unprecedented too, or not quite entirely unprecedented, but not something China had experienced for a few decades. Last month, we analyzed Emperor Xi Jinping's grand coronation. This month, we'll discuss the various strains his zero COVID policy and his economic policies have caused, and what is the significance of the demonstrations. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Glenn. Glenn, what is the significance of all of this?
I'm tempted to say you're punting to give me an impossible issue to answer. Well, I think it's clear. I wrote an assessment of Xi's increasing domination of all levers of power several years ago, and I ended it by saying that even though we could not see any alternative individual or center of power as an alternative, that it was certain that among 1.4 billion people who are normal humans aspiring to individual agency and autonomy to some extent, and who had been exposed to globalization and changing norms and values and rising education, et cetera, that there were some places in waiting successors to Xi who didn't agree with him. But that gets to, I think, a fundamental dynamic of social unrest and even revolution. I'm not saying this is a revolution at all. That mass movements that destabilize a central state and then become revolutionary, actually cause a revolution from below, almost invariably fail. I can think of almost no example in which they've succeeded. Defining success to mean a fundamental.
What about the French Revolution? Wasn't that a
a fundamental change in the nature of the society? You can overthrow a regime, but you don't change the nature of the society. I think that mass movements are in their outcomes and even in their essence conservative. Actually, they rarely seek radical or succeed in achieving radical change. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I see the movement is obviously a desire for a more open society. That means more individual agency, perhaps, but not necessarily a political one. I still find China has two broad currents. This is broad brush, certainly. It remains, despite 75 years of Mao, a fundamentally Confucian society, therefore socially conservative, meaning that it accepts, the society largely accepts levels of authoritarian rule that are strange to an American, while seeking profound personal autonomy. I think that's where the nature of the current aspirations and discontent reside, but it's hard to say how it would evolve. It only takes, it's impossible to predict a mass movement which has so many disparate objectives: freedom from COVID restrictions, freedom to speak out, changes in political organization. All of this is happening. You can see hints of it simultaneously. But then the second thing, and then I'll turn it back to you. So there's this roiling movement occurring in a society which is unlike any in human history. The Chinese government has implemented social controls that really dwarf those described in George Orwell's 1984. It has more control at more levels of society, more awareness of actions by individuals and tools to control them than any society in history. So I am doubtful that a movement could succeed from below in doing what failed in 1989, say in Tiananmen and so many other places. And I would argue even in the Bastille, it overthrew the king, but it didn't change the nature of society or ultimately the regime afterwards. The Jacobins were more totalitarian than the king's
They
authoritarian.
inaugurated the reign of terror. They
Yeah.
gave terror to the world.
So I
Modern
think
terror.
we have these two things: an aspiration for individual autonomy, clearly, and yet a government that's more capable and willing to impose its control with no viable alternative power centers in view than any time in, I think, human history. Really, maybe the Spartans, but I don't know.
I mean, let's take a step back and I'll examine. You've outlined the broad brush, and I'll examine the more immediate, the more proximate causes for these protests. For months, Glenn and I have been analyzing China, and we've had many meetings, and we've had meetings with people in think tanks in Washington, D.C. Our very dear friend Alexander Brenner is obviously far more knowledgeable about China than we are. He's a veritable encyclopedia in more ways than one. And we've interacted also with, thanks to our recent visit, with people shaping China policy in New Delhi, in India. We, in fact, met members of the China think tank of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we've had a wide array of inputs, and not just from the Indians and the Americans, but also from the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Koreans, and the Vietnamese. And so what we hear again and again from most policy circles and think tank circles and even academic circles is an overestimation of the Chinese Communist Party's abilities to ride out an economic crisis. Generally, they think, oh, things are bad, but they are smart. They've lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. They will be able to manage this real estate kerfuffle. And we take, and especially I take, more pessimistic view. I take the view that economies are cyclical. It is inevitable that China is going to go through a slowdown, if not a recession. Households, and we've talked about this in the past, households tend to invest mainly in property. There is no outlet for savings for them comparable to, say, Europe or the US, where people invest in stocks and bonds and more diversified financial assets. And there has been a property bubble, and the collapse of that bubble is going to cause problems in society, is going to cause serious strains in society. Furthermore, as the economy slows down, as people find jobs hard to get by and jobs don't pay as much as they used to, there's bound to be more discontent. It's just the natural cycle of life, natural cycle of economics. Even in the West, economic trouble has led to populism. Look at Italy, they have Giorgia Meloni. And look at the UK, it voted for Brexit, and the US itself had Donald Trump. So there is no exception to human nature, in my view. I'm not a universalist in general, but I take the view that human nature is broadly similar. And China is bound to go through its own economic squeeze, and that economic squeeze is going to lead to discontent. And parallel to an economic slowdown, you've had a tightening of political control. Xi Jinping has literally taken out all other centers of power within the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP post-Mao was a collective endeavor. Deng was, of course, very powerful. He was in my view, the most important and influential statesman of the 20th century, because he could take a step back and say, hang on a minute, what we were doing was wrong. Let's rethink. And that's the most difficult thing for any leader to do. And he did it. But Deng didn't rule like an emperor. He was, of course, the first amongst equals. He was very influential, but there were no purges. There were none of these shenanigans, such as someone being marched out, especially a party elder of the Great Hall. That was new. Yes, there was Tiananmen in 1989, but by the standards of Mao, that was mild stuff. It just was televised. So we have entered a very new era wherein Xi Jinping thought is now incorporated in the constitution. Xi Jinping's many policies have actually exacerbated the economic troubles, the zero COVID policy being one of them. And this aspiration for better living conditions and this aspiration for more freedoms is clashing with Xi Jinping's desire for total control. And in my view, the protests or the revolution may not change the fundamental nature of society, but they are inevitable. At some point, something's going to give. This is not a stable equilibrium.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I'll take I can hold, all of us can hold multiple realities simultaneously, as I learned, experienced firsthand powerfully during my trip to India. But I'm not being facetious. I'll make a counterpoint to what I just said, which I simultaneously believe. I think it is in line with the point you made, Atul, that there are a number of indices of that you can analyze, even measure, I suppose you could say, that indicate an increasing likelihood of civil unrest or even revolution. And for all its successes and continued likelihood of continued growth in power, I think this is the point that you and I made to our Indian Chinese experts, their view essentially was, well, these are bumps in the road. China will master them, will continue its rise ever upward. And our point was bumps in the road, yes, but growing in nature. So a state can continue to rise in power because of its size and increasing expertise in any number of domains while having growing problems. And the indices aren't just these demonstrations. I think the demonstrations are clearly a direct consequence of the COVID restrictions, but will play upon, are influenced by, or what contributes to them in an even deeper sense, are some of these rising structural tensions that lead to dangers for the regime. You have a large percentage, a half or something, of agricultural land in China that is on the verge of being incapable of growing crops anymore. You have strains on employment. You have a poor, shocking thing in a socialist communist society, a terribly poor and social security fabric. The elderly are not provided for, but families no longer provide for them, which is the traditional way, due to urbanization and economic development. You have a real estate bubble where I think we said it was 80-something% of private assets for the country as a whole are invested in real estate because there is no other place to invest them, really. And much of this is fictitious development, buildings, the castles in the desert you used to hear about in Italy, where buildings and projects are done because it's a way of getting financing for cities, but there's no productive result that comes from it. These are empty buildings, and the real estate is vastly over leveraged and is going to fall. All of these things and other indices will lead, and then you have the demographic strain, which is perhaps the greatest of all, where for the last 5 years, the working population in China has literally declined. The overall population continues to grow and will for, 15 years more perhaps, but the working population is declining. So the number of hands producing to those, the number of people who need social support because they're too young or too old, continues to grow. These are almost literally existential strains on the system as it exists. It cannot exist, subsist for long. And then when you have COVID, which in a narrower sense directly affects current production levels and satisfaction levels, but in a deeper sense plays upon these structural issues. And although I'm pessimistic about the revolutionary changes that can come from social unrest, I am progressively concerned, if not alarmed, even at the issues that China is having to address now and is not addressing.
Yeah, two more interesting vignettes for our listeners. One is reports all across the press, and I first read it in the Financial Times, that Jack Ma has been living in Tokyo since China's tech crackdown. So he has basically abandoned his homeland, his motherland, and after the Chinese regulators called off the blockbuster $37 billion initial public offering, IPO, and they fined Alibaba a record $2.8 billion for antitrust abuses last year. Now, there's something else that my brother, who's a partner in Linklaters in Singapore, and he's a lawyer, and he has been talking about it for weeks and months, and this hit the press too. And this is the fact that as many as 500 Chinese companies have quietly re-domiciled or registered in Singapore over the past 12 months in a bid to hedge against rising geopolitical risk as tensions between Beijing and Washington escalate. So if it comes to voting with your feet, a lot of the China's best and brightest and wealthiest are now fleeing the country.
They now live in Vancouver.
A lot of them, yes, exactly. So this is a bit ominous in terms of the future of the Chinese economy. And the big risk I see when you get a big upheaval like this against communism is that people flock to some other ideology. And I think the only ideology that the Chinese can potentially take up now is nationalism, because they've already been led down that path of we were humiliated as a great power. All of our problems are because first of colonial exploitation and humiliation in the 19th century, the Opium Wars, the sacking of the Summer Palace in Beijing by Lord Elgin, of course. His father, of course, stole or borrowed the Elgin marbles from the then Ottoman Empire. Preserved, exactly. That is the Anglo-Saxon point of view. The Greeks, of course, think this was all stolen, but hey-ho, there we go, it doesn't matter. The key thing is that Lord Elgin, of course, the junior, is remembered very fondly in Beijing for the sack of the Summer Palace, in which, of course, Indian troops were involved. He later went on to be Viceroy of India. So the problems in China, from a Chinese perspective and a Chinese historical perspective, come from Anglo-Saxon and indeed foreign interference. The Japanese played their part, of course, a big part. And the current woes of China, the risk of the mob can again be blamed on Uncle Sam now, because Uncle Sam is squeezing China in this new world. No longer will the trade deficit be financed through low interest rates. For a very long time, the model has been buy cheap from China, sell in Walmart, make your money. But now, America with higher interest rates will not be able to finance its trade deficit the way it did. So that is going to change. America is already, and the West is already talking about friendshoring, nearshoring, supply chain security. Demand is going down, and there is a squeeze on supply. the US has already cut out China from advanced computer chip manufacturing, not just access, but also access to manufacturing know-how. That may just delay their progress, but this is a huge hit to the Chinese tech and AI aspirations. So from the Chinese point of view, the West is out to get them. And if communism is a god that fails, just like Russia, they could then go on to another god, which is nationalism. So be careful of what you wish for. The revolution may actually turn out to be much worse than we imagine.
I think that that Xi is a step ahead of you and us in that regard, and clearly the communist leadership before Xi, but Xi more than ever, have decided, well, or assessed, okay, how do we seat and justify, legitimize our control, and it is through we'll make the deal, and many have commented on this. We'll make the deal with the Chinese people that we will help make you rich, and we will play the nationalist card for legitimacy. And this has become more and more ardent in the past decade. And I think all of us who interact with Chinese officials or citizens, or even follow China in the media, can sense how powerful this has become. I think the nationalism is sincerely shared, the perspective, by a wide swath of society, in lieu of what was theoretically communist ardor. I don't think that's existed now for decades, except in a small elite, and not even that now. And that is a danger. So I think that there are dual tensions, though. A state that is more capable of maintaining its control than any society in history, with these growing pressures from below and aspirations of, and frustrations in particular, of the population. But I don't see a likely, at this point, evolution. But I have no crystal ball on the evolution of social unrest towards social political change. That's I don't know anyone who successfully predicted those evolutions, really. But it
sure,
is.
There are a few astrologers who claim they predicted it.
Astrologers, well, okay, and one of them will be right at some point, certainly.
All right.
Well, it's like a stock. It's like stock investors. You know, there's a guru of the day because he had 23% growth and the S&P only went up 12%. But it's sort of, and he becomes the wise sage of the moment. But it was all sort of a random distribution, and next year it'll be somebody else. So I'm modest enough to realize that I'm in that mix like everyone else. But I think these pressure, what I can see are unprecedented, growing structural strains in clash, conflict with historically unique ability of the government to maintain control.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.